had the same opinions that the ancient Egyptians were black and they matched the Colchians and the Ethiopians. For context, this is Ptolemy writing about the Garamantes. At the outset, when writing of the journey from Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of the Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months by journeying continuously southwards. He says furthermore that Julius Meternus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians by bearing continuously southwards, came within 4 months to Augasimbia, the country of the Ethiopians where the rhinoceros is to be found. Each of these statements, on the face of them, is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distant from the Garamantes to require a 3 months journey, seeing that Garamantes are themselves, for the most part, Ethiopians. And now Strabo talking about the Ethiopians being the same as the Egyptians. Well, let us suppose that the poet is ignorant of that existence of the isthmus, but is referring to Ethiopia on the confines of Egypt. When he speaks of Ethiopians that are sundered in twain, what then? Are they not thus sundered in twain? And did the poet make the statement in ignorance? Is not Egypt also, are not the Egyptians also, from the delta up to the Syene, sundered in twain? By the Nile, somewhere Hyperion sits and are somewhere he rises. What is Egypt but a river, which the water floods, and this valley lies on both sides of the river, towards the east and the west. But Ethiopia lies directly beyond Egypt, and it is analogous to Egypt in its relation both to the Nile and other physical characteristics of the regions in question. For it too is narrow, long, and subject to inundation, and its parts that lie beyond the territory subject to inundations are desert, without water, and habitable only in spots both on the east and the west. Of course, then Ethiopia also is sundered in twain. Or again, did the Nile seem important enough for those who were drawing a boundary line between Asia and Libya to serve as a boundary line? Since in length it stretches towards the south for more than 10,000 stadia, and is such width that it contains islands with many thousands of inhabitants, the largest of which is Meroe, the residence of the king and the metropolis of the Ethiopians, and yet was not important enough to sunder Ethiopia itself in twain. And furthermore, the critics of the men who make the river Nile the boundary line between the continents bring this against them as their most serious charge, that they dismember Egypt and Ethiopia, and that they reckon one part of each country to Libya and one part to Asia, or that if they do not wish such dismemberment, then either they do not divide the continents at all, or else do not make the river the boundary line. But Ethiopia may be divided in still another way, quite apart from this. For all those who have made coasting voyages on the ocean along the shores of Libya, whether they started from the Red Sea or from the Pillars of Hercules, always turned back after they have advanced a certain distance, because they were hindered by many perplexing circumstances, and consequently they left in the minds of most people the conviction that the intervening space was blocked by an isthmus, and yet the whole Atlantic Ocean is one unbroken body of water, and this particularly true of the Southern Atlantic. All those voyagers have spoken of at least district to which they come in their voyage as Ethiopic territory, and have so reported, wherein then lies the absurdity if Homer too was misled by a report of this character and divided the Ethiopians in two groups, placing the one group in the east and the other in the west, since it was not known whether the intervening people really existed or not. Furthermore, Ephorus mentions still another ancient tradition, and it is not unreasonable to believe that Homer also had heard it. Ephorus says that the Tetsassians report that Ethiopians overran Libya as far as Dyrus, and that some of them stayed in Dyrus, while others occupied the great part of the seaboard. And he conjectures it was from the circumstances that Homer spoke as he did, Ethiopians that are sundered in twain, the furthermost of men. These arguments one might urge in reply to Aristarchus and his followers. I maintain, for example, that in accordance with the opinions of the Greeks, just as they embraced the inhabitants of the known countries of the north under the single designation Scythians or nomads, to use Homer's term, and just as later when the inhabitants of the west also discovered they were called Celts and Iberians, or by the compound word Celtiberians and Celtoscythians, the several people being classed under one name through ignorance of the facts. I maintain, I say, that just so, in accordance with the opinion of the ancient Greeks, all the countries in the south which lie on Oceanus were called Ethiopia. And by the same reckoning, the whole width of the habitable world amounts to 79 degrees 25, or altogether 40,000 stadia. For greater context, we must talk about the fact that Garamantes are a black race. But in order to prove this, we have to look at multiple sources of Greek writers and see exactly what they said about this. Now, Homer says that Menelaus came to Ethiopia, not meaning that he really came into Ethiopia, but that he reached its frontier next to Egypt. For perhaps at the time, the frontier was still nearer Thebes, though today it is quite near. I mean the frontier that runs by Syene and Philae. Of these towns, the former belongs to Egypt, but Philae is inhabited alike by Ethiopians and Egyptians. And now Strabo will make the comparison that Herodotus made last time, that the Colchis were partly Egyptian. For instance, the migration of Western Iberians to the regions beyond the Pontus and the Colchis region, which are separated from Armenia by the Araxes according to Apollodorus, but rather by the river Cyrus and the Moschakian mountains, and the migration of Egyptians to Ethiopia and Colchis. And just to prove it, let's show the statement by Herodotus, where he says, "For the Colchians were evidently Egyptians, and I say this having myself observed it before I heard it from others. And as it was a matter of interest to me, I inquired of both people and the Colchians, and more recollection of Egyptians than the Egyptians had of the Colchians. Yet the Egyptians said that they thought the Colchians descended from the army of Sesostris, and I formed my conjecture not only because they are swarthy and curly-headed, for this amounts to nothing, because others are so likewise, but chiefly from the following circumstances, because the Colchians, Egyptians, and Ethiopians are the only nations of the world who from the first have practiced circumcision. And finally, he gives a summary of North Africa. They call the most southerly peoples Ethiopians. Those who live next north of the Ethiopians, they call the, in Maine, Garamantians, Pharusians, and Nigritans. Those who live still north of these, later Gaetalans. Those who live near the sea or even on the sea coast next to Egypt and as far as Cyrene, Merindinis, while they call those beyond Syene and Citrus Scylians, Nasamonians, and certain of the Gaetalans. And now Pliny joins in. We must deal next with the results connected with these heavenly causes, for it is beyond question that the Ethiopians are burnt by the heat of the heavenly body near them, and are born with a scorched appearance, with curly beard and hair, and that in the opposite region of the world the races have white frosty skin, with yellow hair that hangs straight, while the latter are fierce owing to the rigidity of their climate, but the former wise because of the mobility of theirs. And their legs themselves prove that with the former the juice is called away into the upper portion of the body by the nature of heat, while with the latter it is driven down to the lower parts of falling moisture. In the latter countries, dangerous wild beasts are found. So as you can see here, he's comparing Germanic people to Ethiopians, saying that it must be the environment that makes the people look the way they do. And that's why the Ethiopians are black with curly hair, while the Germanic people have straight hair and it's yellow and they have a very pale skin. He continues to describe the people based on their height this time. But in both regions, men's stature is high, owing in former to the pressure of the fires, and in the latter to the nourishment effect of the damp, whereas in the middle of the earth, owing the healthy blending of both elements, there are traits that are fertile for all sorts of produce, and men are of medium bodily stature, with a marked blending even in the matter of complexion.